These are your lecture notes for Chapter 4, the tissue level of organization. For time's sake, I might skip through some slides, but that's just simply for the sake of time. Tissues are defined as collections of specialized cells and cell products that perform a limited number of functions. Histology is the study of tissues. So tissues are collections of cells. Histology is the study of tissues. And in this chapter, we're going to learn the 4 basic types of tissues, but we will focus primarily on the first 2 types: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. And the reason we won't spend as much time on muscle and nervous tissue is simply because we have an entire chapter on skeletal muscle, and we have an entire chapter on the nervous system where we will cover those tissues. So this is a diagram that explains the categories of tissues. Tissues form from cells and extracellular material and fluids, sometimes protein fibers and extracellular fluid or tissue fluid. And sometimes tissues are just formed from cells, very little extracellular material. The epithelial tissue primarily functions in covering exposed surfaces like skin, lining internal passageways and chambers, like lining the inside of a blood vessel, producing glandular secretions such as sweat glands, oil glands, and mammary glands. These are glandular secretions that are secreted onto the surface of your skin. Connective tissue fills internal spaces, provides structural support. So fills internal spaces would be like fat. Structural support would be like bone, and stores energy also would be fat would also store energy. Muscle tissue is functions to contract, and nervous tissue functions to conduct electrical impulses. So contraction is the major function of muscle tissue. Conduction is the major function of nervous tissue. And all of these tissues combine to form organs, and multiple organs combine to form organ systems. Epithelial tissue overview. Epithelial tissue covers internal and external body surfaces. So if you just remember that epithelial tissue forms coverings and linings. Most glands are derived from epithelial tissue, and there are some essential functions provided by epithelial tissue. The characteristics of epithelial tissue are that the cells are always bound closely together. There's not a lot of extracellular material surrounding the cells. The cells are packed very, very tightly to each other. The cells always have a free surface or an apical surface that is exposed either to the outside of your body or to some interior. For example, the surface of the lining of your intestines. So if this were a cross section through your intestines, you've got epithelial tissue that covers the outside. Then you've got epithelial that covers the inside lining, and the surface that faces the opening in your intestines is called the apical surface. So a free surface that is not connected to anything else is called the apical surface. And then the epithelial tissue is always attached to the underlying connective tissue by a basement membrane. Epithelial tissue is avascular. It lacks a blood supply, and epithelial tissue is continually replaced or regenerated. The locations would be coverings and linings. So examples are skin, internal passageways, covering the internal passageways, like covering the outside of the stomach, covering the outside of the bladder, covering the outside of the lungs, covering the outside of the ovaries or the testes, and forming selective barriers, barriers that allow certain materials to cross and don't allow others to cross. So they also, epithelial tissue also lines internal cavities and passageways. So the cavities around the lungs and the heart, and the epithelial tissue will help to prevent friction. The four essential functions are to provide physical protection. Example of this would be the skin or the integument. To control permeability, any epithelial tissue controls is selective in what it allows to pass through the tissue and what it prevents from passing through, kind of like the plasma membrane. To provide sensation, so epithelial tissue, again, your skin would be an example of that. Epithelial tissue can have nerve endings that function in providing sensation. And to produce specialized secretions, and we call these glandular epithelium or glands. The glands are either exocrine glands, in which the secretions of the glands are discharged onto the surface of the epithelium through a duct. The key is that the secretions are secreted through a duct or small passageway. Whereas if it's an endocrine gland, the secretions, which we call hormones, are released into tissue fluid and then into your blood. So hormones released into the blood would be endocrine. Now, the cells are attached to each other in different ways. Intercellular connections include attachment materials like CAMs or cell adhesion molecules, proteoglycans that bind the cell adhesion molecules to each other and to the extracellular materials. And the cell junctions can be divided into four types. Tight junctions form a tight seal so that they don't allow materials to enter or leave the epithelial tissue. For example, lining the urinary bladder. We don't want urine to leak out of the urinary bladder, so it is lined with tight junctions. Gap junctions are connections that have a gap or a channel running through them so that ions and small particles can flow from cell to cell, even though the cells are connected to each other. Spot desmosomes are like similar to a spot weld. It's just a very, very strong connection at one spot. And hemidesmosomes are half of a desmosome, and you find those connecting the basement membrane to the connective tissue beneath. And this is a picture of all the different cell junctions. I was trying to see if I could make it bigger. Hold on, maybe I can do this. Yeah, there we go. All right, so that's as much as it's going to do, but the gap junctions you can see here this is the exterior surface, and I can only point, but this is what it looks like if you were to do a cross section. So this is what it looks like. This would be one cell membrane and another cell membrane. So these are two different cells, and these are connections between the cells that also have a gap that allows ions to move through. And you can find tight junctions. These are tight junctions, which you can find in tissues such as the tissue that lines the urinary bladder. And then a spot desmosome contains cell adhesion molecules or CAMs. To me, they look like oars. that you use, with a canoe that you use to row a boat with. Those are cell adhesion molecules, and then the proteoglycans is the material that um, surrounds the cell adhesion molecules and helps them to bind more tightly to each other. The basement membrane, let's see, the basement membrane. Okay, so what these hemidesmosomes are doing is attaching the bottom surface of an epithelial cell to the basement membrane. So the hemidesmosomes attach cells to the basement membrane. All right, I think that's it. So let's get smaller. The apical surface is the surface that is not attached to any other cells. It's exposed to an internal or external environment. Sometimes it will have folds called microvilli that function to increase the surface area. For example, in the small intestines, if you do a cross section through the intestines, instead of being smooth, that lining is folded. And then within those folds are even more folds called microvilli. And the more folding you have in a membrane, the more surface area there is, so the more nutrients can be absorbed. Cilia can be attached to the apical surface. Cilia move materials along the surface. The respiratory tract moves mucus along. The uterine or fallopian tubes have cilia that moves the egg toward the uterus. And another example with men is the movement of the sperm through the male reproductive tract until the sperm can swim on their own, because they can't swim until they're fully mature. And it's important to note that in humans, cilia is not for movement. If you ever took biology, there are some organisms, some microorganisms that use cilia to help them move. But in humans, cilia is used to move material across the surface of the cell. The basement membrane lies between the epithelial cells and the underlying connective tissue. It provides strength, resists distortion, acts as a barrier to proteins and other large molecules. So the main thing is that it lies between the epithelial tissue and the underlying connective tissue. Epithelial tissue is able to regenerate, to renew and repair. So this occurs because epithelial tissue contains its own stem cells or germinative cells. And the continuous division of stem cells occurs in the deepest levels near the basement membrane. So the continuous division, what we're talking about here, is mitosis. Okay, we're going to go over number 6. What physiological functions are enhanced by the presence of microvilli? Microvilli increases surface area. So in the intestines, it increases the surface area for the absorption of nutrients. Your intestines can absorb more nutrients when there's microvilli lining the inside of the intestinal walls. And cilia is for moving materials over the surface of the cell. Classifying epithelia. Classification of epithelia is done by the number of layers of cells. Either there's one single layer, and then we would call that simple, or there's many layers, and we would call that stratified. And then the cells can have 3 different shapes. Squamous is flat, cuboidal is cubic shaped, and then columnar is tall.